The year is 1899. The high desert of Colorado is a place of extremes, jagged peaks, sudden storms, and a silence so profound it feels heavy. At the edge of Colorado Springs, far from the bustling storefronts and the smoke of the railroads, stands a structure that defies the architectural logic of the Victorian age. It is a massive wooden barn, nearly 80 feet square, topped by a slender, tapering mast that reaches 142 feet into the thin mountain air. At the very tip of this mast sits a copper sphere, gleaming under the relentless sun. To the locals, it is an oddity, a curiosity built by a man who had already become a legend in the salons of New York and the laboratories of Europe. They know him as the wizard who harnessed Niagara Falls, the man who brought the alternating current to the masses. But here, in the shadow of Pikes Peak, Nikola Tesla is hunting for something much more elusive than a better motor. He is hunting for the heartbeat of the Earth itself. Inside the station, the air smells of ozone and heated metal. There are no windows, only a series of vents to allow the heat of the massive electrical discharges to escape. In the center of the room sits the magnifying transmitter, a primary coil 51 feet in diameter. It is a cathedral of copper and wood, designed to do what every contemporary scientist believed was impossible: to move power across the globe without a single inch of wire. On a particular night in late autumn, as the story goes, a small group of observers gathered several miles away from the laboratory. The ground beneath their feet was dry, the darkness of the plains absolute. In their hands they held ordinary incandescent light bulbs. There were no batteries, no hidden cables, no connection to any known power source. Then the signal was given. Far off in the distance, the laboratory began to hum a sound that residents later described as a low, guttural roar that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. Suddenly, the darkness was shattered. The bulbs in the observers' hands did not flicker or dim. They glowed with a steady, brilliant light. 26 miles of empty space stood between the laboratory and these lights. Yet the energy had found its way. But as the witnesses stared at the glowing glass in their palms, the hum from the station reached a deafening crescendo, followed by a silence that was even more terrifying. The experiment had worked, but it had come at a cost that no one, not even Tesla, had fully calculated. And that's when things began to shift. To understand how a city could be powered by a wireless grid in 1899, we have to look at the world as it was then, a world draped in a chaotic web of wires. The early electrical age was a messy, dangerous era. In cities like New York and Chicago, the sky was literally obscured by thousands of telegraph, telephone, and power lines, often sagging under the weight of ice or falling during storms, electrocuting horses and pedestrians. The war of currents between Thomas Edison's direct current and the alternating current favored by George Westinghouse and Tesla had been a brutal public battle of propaganda. By 1899, alternating current had won the industrial war, but for Tesla, wires were a primitive bridge to a much grander future. He viewed the Earth not as a solid, inert rock, but as a giant conductor, a reservoir of energy waiting to be tapped. Historical records suggest that Tesla chose Colorado Springs for 3 specific reasons: the dryness of the air, the altitude, and the frequency of lightning. He didn't just want to create electricity. He wanted to synchronize his machines with the natural electrical resonance of the planet. He was looking for the stationary waves of the Earth, the idea that the world itself could store an electrical charge and, if vibrated at the right frequency, could transmit that charge to any point on its surface. During those first months of 1899, his journals describe a man possessed. He worked through the night, his silhouette often seen against the blue flashes emanating from the vents of his laboratory. He was obsessed with tuning, Just as a musical instrument can make a distant glass shatter if the right note is struck, Tesla believed he could strike an electrical note that the Earth would amplify. In the summer of 1899, he began his most ambitious series of tests. Local newspapers at the time reported strange phenomena occurring in the vicinity of the lab. Horses would suddenly bolt as sparks jumped between their shoes and the cobblestones. Butterflies were seen fluttering with small halos of blue light around their wings. Even the water fountains in the town square occasionally gave off small shocks to those who leaned in for a drink. The locals were fascinated, but they were also becoming uneasy. There were rumors that Tesla was doing more than just testing equipment. Some believed he was tapping into something he couldn't control. And yet, the results he was achieving in private were staggering. He claimed to have successfully lit 200 lamps and powered an electric motor over a distance that modern physics still struggles to reconcile with the technology of the time. But while the technical achievements were mounting, the financial foundations of the project were beginning to crack. Tesla was a visionary, but he was a poor accountant. Every spark that leapt from his transmitter cost money, provided by backers like J.P. Morgan, who were looking for a return on their investment in the form of a global communication system, not a free energy grid for the world. What happened next remains unclear, but the laboratory's logs and local accounts point toward a singular, catastrophic event in the fall of 1899. Tesla had pushed the magnifying transmitter to its absolute limit. He wanted to see if he could create a global resonance. As the power climbed, the artificial lightning bolts produced by the machine reached lengths of over 135 feet. The thunder from these discharges could be heard in Cripple Creek, 15 miles away. The very air around the laboratory became ionized, glowing with a faint, ethereal violet light. Then, the power grid of Colorado Springs simply died. The city was plunged into darkness. The main generator at the El Paso Electric Company had been set on fire by the massive surge of feedback from Tesla's experiments. The wireless grid had worked, it had moved massive amounts of energy, but it had also overwhelmed the existing infrastructure of the modern world. Tesla was forced to repair the city's generator at his own expense, but the damage to his reputation among the local utility boards was done. More importantly, this moment served as a warning. He had proven that the Earth could carry power, but he had also shown that such power was volatile, invisible, and incredibly difficult to meter. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, Tesla prepared to leave Colorado. He dismantled the interior of the lab, but the structure remained, a silent sentinel on the plains. He returned to New York with trunks full of data and a plan for a world wireless system to be built at Wardenclyffe on Long Island. He told his backers that the Colorado experiments were a complete success. However, some historians believe that the data Tesla brought back from the mountains contained a secret, a realization that the wireless grid he had built in 1899 wasn't just a prototype for a radio tower. It was something much more transformative and much more dangerous to the status quo of the burgeoning energy industry. For a few weeks in 1899, if the accounts are to be believed, a small corner of the American West lived in a future that we still haven't reached today. A world where the air itself was a conduit for power. But the evidence of this grid began to disappear almost as quickly as it had been discovered. The lab sat empty, a ghost of a future that never arrived, until 1904, when the final order was given to tear it down. What they found during the dismantling of the station, however, changed the narrative entirely. When the demolition crews arrived at the Colorado Springs laboratory in 1904, they expected to find a hollowed-out shell, the remnants of a failed venture by a man who had moved on to bigger ambitions in the East. Instead, they encountered an engineering puzzle that defied the standard construction practices of the time. While the wooden exterior of the lab was unremarkable, the foundation told a different story. Records suggest that as the workers pulled up the floorboards, They discovered a sophisticated network of iron pipes and copper plating that extended deep into the Earth's crust. This wasn't merely a grounding wire for lightning protection. It was a deliberate, massive, subterranean interface. Tesla had spent months drilling into the water table, creating what he called a grip on the planet. Some historians believe these underground structures were designed to vibrate the very electrical potential of the Earth, treating the globe like a giant bell. But as the crews worked, a strange detail began to circulate among the locals. Several pieces of the heavy machinery, most notably the primary-secondary coils that were the heart of the magnifying transmitter, were missing. There was no record of them being shipped back to New York. They hadn't been sold at auction to cover Tesla's mounting debts. It was as if the most vital components of the 1,899 grid had simply vanished into the Colorado dust. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In the decades following the lab's destruction, researchers found fragments of Tesla's correspondence that hinted at a much longer period of operation than previously thought. While the official history records the 1,899 experiments as a series of short explosive tests, some personal letters suggest a continuous state of excitation that lasted for several weeks. During this period, according to these accounts, the laboratory wasn't just drawing power from the city's coal-fired plant. It was allegedly feeding something back. There are unverified reports from residents of the era who claim that for a period in late 1899, their electric bills were non-existent, or that the streetlights in the northern part of the city remained lit, even when the central station was undergoing maintenance. This is where the timeline of established history begins to blur with the legend of the wireless grid. The traditional scientific view is that Tesla's experiments were a spectacular failure of efficiency, that the energy lost to the atmosphere made wireless power an impossible dream. However, some researchers point to Tesla's unique understanding of resonance. He wasn't trying to broadcast power through the air like a radio signal. He was trying to create a standing wave within the Earth itself. If Tesla had succeeded in finding the Earth's resonant frequency, he wouldn't have needed a massive amount of initial power to maintain the grid. He would only have needed to provide timed pushes to keep the energy moving, much like a person pushing a child on a swing. But if this self-sustaining grid actually existed for those few weeks in 1899, it raises a chilling question. Why was it never allowed to grow? The answer may lie in the archives of the men who funded the dawn of the 20th century. In 1900, Tesla secured $150,000 from J.P. Morgan to begin work on Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island. On the surface, the project was a communications hub intended to bridge the Atlantic with wireless messages. But Tesla's secret ambition was to replicate and scale his Colorado Springs success, to provide free or nearly free power to every corner of the globe. Morgan, a man whose empire was built on the ownership of resources and the control of distribution, was initially intrigued by the idea of wireless communication. But there is a persistent story, one that historians still debate today, concerning a meeting between the financier and the inventor. When Tesla finally revealed that the tower's true purpose was the wireless transmission of power, Morgan reportedly asked a single, devastating question: where do I put the meter? Whether or not the quote is apocryphal, the sentiment was reflected in the sudden shift in Morgan's support. Shortly after the 1899 experiments were concluded and the results were analyzed, the flow of capital to Tesla began to dry up. The revolutionary grid he had envisioned was not just a technical challenge, it was an economic threat, and that's when the pressure began to mount. Back in Colorado, the aftermath of the 1,899 experiments left a lingering mark on the community. Personal stories from the time describe a feeling of heavy air that persisted for months after Tesla left. Some residents claimed that their clocks behaved strangely, or that they felt a constant subtle tingle in their skin when walking near the old laboratory site. One particular account from a former lab assistant, who spoke years later under a pseudonym, described a night when the transmitter was running at a low hum for 3 days straight. According to this witness, the power wasn't coming from the El Paso Electric Company anymore. Instead, the meters in the lab were running backward. Tesla allegedly watched the needles with a grim expression, realizing that he had tapped into a source of energy that was far more potent and far less controllable than even he had anticipated. But, as with many stories from this period, there is no clear consensus on the validity of these claims. The scientific community at the time remained deeply skeptical. They argued that even if Tesla had discovered a way to transmit power, the sheer danger of such high-voltage fields would make it impossible to implement in a populated city. They saw his wireless grid not as a miracle, but as a lightning hazard of global proportions. Despite the skepticism, Tesla's work in 1899 forced a transformation in the way the world thought about energy. For the first time, the idea that power could be untethered from the physical world was no longer science fiction. It was a tangible, if terrifying, reality. As the 1900s progressed, Tesla became increasingly isolated. His grand tower at Wardenclyffe stood as a skeleton, never completed, never fully activated. The world was moving toward a different kind of grid, one of copper wires, metered consumption, and centralized control. The fleeting weeks of the Colorado wireless system were being erased from the public consciousness, replaced by the narrative of the mad scientist whose dreams had outstripped his results. But in 1903, just months before the Colorado lab was finally raised, a series of strange atmospheric phenomena were recorded across the United States. Observers from as far away as the Atlantic coast reported unusual auroras and electrical disturbances that didn't align with solar activity. Some researchers believe these were the final, dying echoes of the Colorado experiment, a massive pulse of energy that had been circling the globe, finally dissipating into the ether. The dismantling of the 1,899 grid was more than just the destruction of a building. It was the closing of a door. The copper was melted down, the iron pipes were pulled from the earth, and the land was eventually cleared for residential development. Today, a small plaque marks the spot, but it tells very little of what truly happened during that strange autumn. What remained, however, were the patents. Tesla filed dozens of them based on his Colorado work, and it is in these technical drawings that the ghost of the wireless grid lives on. They describe a world of terrestrial stationary waves and oscillatory currents that modern engineers are only now beginning to reconsider. Yet, as more evidence is unearthed from Tesla's private journals and the archives of the power companies of the era, the story of 1,899 takes on a more complex tone. It wasn't just about a man and his machine. It was about a fundamental disagreement on what the future of humanity should look like. While the official record states the project ended due to a lack of funds and technical limitations, there are those who believe the grid was actually too successful. They argue that the 1,899 system proved that power could be decentralized, and that was a reality the world of 1,899 simply wasn't prepared to handle. The disappearance of the physical laboratory in Colorado did not end the mystery. It only shifted the search into the realm of archives and encrypted journals. When Tesla died in 1,943 inches, a New York hotel room, the government's Office of Alien Property moved with uncharacteristic speed to seize his trunks, filled with decades of notes. Within those papers were the Colorado Springs logs documents that had been meticulously kept but rarely shared. What researchers found in those papers was a man who seemed to have discovered a different law of physics than the one taught in universities. Tesla's notes from 1,899 frequently refer to the burning of the atmosphere and the pulsation of the terrestrial globe. Some historians believe that Tesla wasn't just building a power plant. He was attempting to treat the entire Earth as a giant capacitor. If the planet could hold a charge, then the 1899 grid wasn't a localized experiment at all. It was the first time a human being had successfully plugged into the kinetic energy of the revolving world. But that wasn't the strangest part of the archive. Among the technical drawings were sketches of receivers that looked nothing like the bulky machinery of the Victorian era. They were small, handheld devices that resembled modern portable electronics. It suggests that Tesla's 1899 grid wasn't just about lighting street lamps. It was designed for a world where every individual could tap into a global reservoir of energy. In the mid-20th century, as the Cold War intensified, some of Tesla's concepts resurfaced in the most unlikely of places. High-frequency atmospheric research programs began to echo the experiments performed in that wooden barn in Colorado. Scientists began to officially recognize what Tesla had claimed in 1899, that the Earth's ionosphere is indeed a conductive layer, and that the space between the ground and the sky is a resonant cavity. Today, we call this the Schumann resonance, a set of spectrum peaks in the extremely low frequency portion of the Earth's electromagnetic field. Tesla had identified these frequencies 50 years before they were officially discovered. But while modern science uses these frequencies for lightning detection and climate monitoring, Tesla's ultimate goal, drawing usable power from them, remains a subject of intense debate. There is no clear consensus on whether Tesla's 1899 system could truly have scaled to the entire planet. Modern critics point to the inverse square law, which states that energy dissipates rapidly over distance. They argue that the sheer amount of power required to keep the Earth ringing with electricity would be catastrophic for the environment. Yet, supporters of Tesla's vision point to his specific use of longitudinal waves, a type of wave that supposedly does not lose energy as it travels. If such waves exist, it would mean that the energy Tesla transmitted in 1899 didn't travel in the traditional sense. Instead, it simply became present everywhere at once. This leads to a startling realization. If Tesla was right, the grid didn't need to be built. It was already there, hidden in the very fabric of the planet, waiting for the right key to unlock it. In the decades since his death, there have been numerous attempts to recreate the Colorado Springs transmitter. Small-scale models have successfully lit bulbs wirelessly over short distances, but the scale of the 1899 experiment has never been fully replicated. The sheer cost, combined with the intense electromagnetic interference such a device would create in our modern, wireless-dependent world, makes a full-scale test nearly impossible today. We have built a world on frequencies that would be drowned out by the roar of a Tesla transmitter. What we are left with are the echoes of those few weeks in 1899, a brief window where the rules of the world seemed to change. The stories of the glowing city and the wireless lamps have passed from eyewitness accounts into the realm of folklore, but the technical possibility remains a ghost in our machines. Some believe that the data from 1899 was never truly lost, but rather absorbed into classified military projects that still operate today. Others suggest that Tesla realized his discovery was too powerful for a world still defined by borders and conflict, and that he deliberately obscured his most important findings. There is a final, lingering detail from the Colorado journals that often goes overlooked. In the final days of the experiment, Tesla recorded receiving signals that he believed were from another world. At the time, he was ridiculed for this, but modern analysis of the data suggests he may have been the first person to ever record a pulsar, a rotating neutron star, using his massive transmitter as a radio telescope. It serves as a reminder that the 1899 grid wasn't just an electrical project. It was an attempt to bridge the gap between humanity and the fundamental forces of the universe. Tesla viewed the Earth not as a resource to be mined, but as a living, vibrating entity that we were meant to live in harmony with. As we look back at the 1,899 wireless grid, we are forced to confront a difficult question. Was it a brilliant failure or a suppressed success? The evidence is buried under a century of dust, lost in the transition from the steam age to the digital age. We live in a world defined by the meter, by the wires that cross our ceilings, and the bills that arrive in our mail. But for those few weeks in the high desert of Colorado, the wires were gone. The light was free. And for a brief moment, the silence of the mountains was replaced by the hum of a future that we are still trying to understand. The site where the laboratory once stood is now a quiet residential neighborhood. There are no sparks in the air, no halos around the wings of butterflies. The people who live there go about their lives, plugged into a grid that Tesla helped build, yet disconnected from the one he truly envisioned. Whether his 1,899 grid was a dangerous hallucination or the greatest lost opportunity in human history remains a matter of perspective. Perhaps the technology wasn't dismantled because it didn't work. Perhaps it was dismantled because it worked too well, and in doing so, it threatened to change the world faster than the world was ready to be changed. The documents are silent. The foundations are gone. What happened in the Colorado dock remains one of the greatest what-ifs of the modern era, a haunting reminder that the path of progress is not a straight line, but a series of choices. And sometimes, the most revolutionary paths are the ones we choose to leave behind.